What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over auto detection of controllers part 2. Really, this whole long string of episodes has been all about controllers, calling it auto detection because we want to have some things done automatically when we have certain devices in. So in the first auto detection of controllers, we had keyboard and controllers. So basically, a player could use a controller and a keyboard and swap between them, and the game would know which one they were currently using, able to swap their controls or the functions that they were calling due to that. On top of that, we also want to have two players be able to control a character on a controller each. So we want to be able to have two controllers, one controlling each character. We already have this logic working, but now that we've switched things over to the base player controllers, and we can switch between keyboard and controllers in the middle of a match, there are a few things that we should fix up to make everything work as intended here. There is one other thing that we're going to have to do regarding controllers, which is connection and disconnection. We haven't gone into that yet, but we will be getting into it in the near future. We want everything to be working before we get to that point. That way, any bugs that come from that can be solved on that logic alone. We don't want to be fighting the rest of the logic in our game before we get into that type of stuff. Alright. So with all that said, we can go ahead and get started, but before we do, you can click this icon in the top right corner right here if you want to get caught up to every episode of the fighting game tutorial series. I believe we're on episode 139, so if you'd like to get caught up, we've done quite a bit, and you can check out everything we've done in that playlist. Alternatively, if you just care about the controller episodes, I'll link you to the first part of the controller episodes right here in this icon in the top right corner. And that's where we initially set up the two players on one keyboard with a controller that can swap out player one. Alright, moving on to today's episode. So what we're going to do today is fix up some controller logic so that two controllers can work with our base player controller system, and they can also swap out, as you saw. So we can have players swapping out player one and player two, swapping their controllers in the middle of a match. They can go from keyboard to controller, controller to keyboard, or gamepad to gamepad even. You can have two different gamepads as well. This will be especially important when we go into the disconnection of controllers, because say I'm using a controller and the batteries die or it becomes unplugged. It's going to disconnect. I should still be able to control my character with another input device. It could be that one that reconnects. Say I put more batteries in it or I plug it back in. Alternatively, I might have to switch controllers in the middle of a match. If I do, I want to make sure I can connect to that new input device that I'm using. So to do this, we have a few different methods and a few different things that we have to set up to make all this work as intended. Very first thing I'm going to do is in the code. So let's go to our base player controller.cpp. Now, currently we have a system where we determine if a key is for a keyboard or a gamepad, and this allows us to change the type of input device that we are using. With that in place, we still need to be able to know what button the character presses, or the player presses, and what action the character should do. So, if we were playing before, we had the ability to swap between keyboard and gamepad, as I keep mentioning, but player 2 could never go back to the keyboard. If they swapped to controller, they could never get access to the keyboard again. What I'm going to show you is how you can always keep player 2 on the player 2 controls and player 1 on the player 1 controls on a keyboard. So even if we swap the two gamepads, if player 2 decides they want to use keyboard, they can switch to keyboard. And if player 1 decides they want to use keyboard, they can switch there. Now, there is one thing that we're not going to cover today, which is if player 1 is on a gamepad and player 2 is on a keyboard, they can take player 1's keyboard controls. This was actually a requested topic, and I will be covering it. But it is unique, and it will not work under these circumstances. These are specifically keeping player 2's controls player 2. So they can switch back to the keyboard and still be using the player 2 keyboard logic. All right. So if we go down to our function, determine input device details in our base player controller, this is where we determined if the input that was pressed was inputs that were the default values on a keyboard, or if they were the inputs that were specific to keyboard mode, where multiple players are playing on one device, which is the keyboard. If they were playing on one device, then I did not want to override player 1's controller to be a keyboard. If they were on a controller, player 2 pressed a button on the keyboard, we didn't want to swap the player 1 to be playing on the keyboard. That doesn't make sense. So player 1 and player 2 were kept separately in that regard. What we were doing is using this boolean, found keyboard mode only input, and if that was found to be true, then we knew that this should not override player 1's device, and that's good. But player 2 also needs a way to be able to go back to keyboard, if they so choose. So to do this, where we had our if statement, if found keyboard mode only input, we determined it through these if statements above, these for loops and these if statements above. We're keeping all of them the same, but we're going to add a bit of additional logic. We're going to add all this, and let's see, all this. Okay, so we're going to add all this today. And it's actually pretty easy logic, but we just have to think about how we want it to work. So say player 1 is on a gamepad, player 2 is on a gamepad. Player 2 goes off of a gamepad, decides that they press a key on the keyboard that is found to be a player 2 specific input. If this is true, we want to switch them back to the keyboard, not gamepad. But we don't want to override player 1's controller from a gamepad to be the keyboard. Okay, so we're going to do essentially the opposite of this operation. To do this, we need a reference specifically to player 2 because this is a keyboard mode hack solution. So this will work for all keyboard mode instances, but it's not needed for controllers. So we do need to grab player 2 specifically. That's the only one we care about in this case. All right. So under the for loops we had in the previous episodes, I go ahead and I grab the game mode, which you probably know how to do this by now. We've done this a bunch. But basically, if you call get world, get auth game mode, it's going to grab the game mode from the server. We're going to cast it to our game mode type, which is Fighter Template Game Mode. If this cast succeeds, it will be set to this variable. If it fails, it'll just skip out the if statement. But if it fails, we don't need to be doing this logic anyway at the moment. So no harm done. I just encapsulated this if statement in this set of branching logic because we don't need to do anything else if the game mode can't be cast to right now. We also need to grab a reference to player 2, and we want to make sure it's valid before using it, otherwise we could have a crash, because player 2 might not exist in the game mode, even if the game mode is valid, in which case we could cause a crash here, so we want to avoid that. So we're going to make sure this is valid by doing auto player 2 ref equals the game mode variable we just made, and grabbing player 2 from it. Just a reminder, the Fighter Template Game Mode has references to player 1 and player 2 on it. Now, if this is valid, this means that player 2 already exists. Player 2 in this case is referencing a specific character, not an actual player in this case. However, it'll work all the same because we're just going to grab the controller on the character. And now, if player 2 reference is also valid, then we can go ahead and continue on with this logic. So, if player 2 reference is valid, it could be AI, it could be another player, doesn't really matter in this case. We just need to know if it's valid. The important part for the actual if statement is this right here. So, last time we were checking to make sure that it wasn't a keyboard mode only input, and then we were setting the is input device gamepad true or false. Well, we need to do this for player 2 as well. There's a fancy way we can do this. So now that we know exactly who player 2 is, regardless who pressed this button, because remember, a keyboard can have multiple players playing on it. With that said, we can't distinguish what player pressed the key, but based on the buttons they pressed, we might be able to determine what the action or the intention was. So, if we go ahead and cast the controller that the player 2 reference has to a base player controller type, we can grab the variables that exist within base player controller. Is input device gamepad is one of the variables on the controller. So we can check to see if player 2's controller is a gamepad currently, and the input that was pressed was a keyboard mode only input. Okay? If either of these for loops above found that the input pressed was a keyboard mode only input, then we know that it was a keyboard mode hack, so it was specifically the P2 controls that were pressed, but the current device is a gamepad. If this is the case, then what we want to do is set the input device to be a gamepad. I'm still doing my check for if it is a gamepad key, even though if this is found, we can assume it is a gamepad key. If any of this fails, so if this is false, okay, if we did not find a keyboard mode only input, if player 2's controller is not a gamepad, you could even check if the player 2 reference get controller was valid, or if the cast itself failed, then just go to the else. All these conditions should just go straight to the else. And with this in place, now player 1 and player 2 will be able to do what you saw earlier, where they can switch between gamepad and keyboard. All right, and that's all the code we need to make that happen. There is one other function we have to write. We can go ahead and do it now, and I'll show you what it's used for in a few minutes. But if we go into our base player controller.h, I made a new U function that's blueprint callable, and I called it clear possessed pawn. This is important for rematches. After we set up our player controllers, rematches would no longer allow the characters to be controlled. This is because the possessed pawn was set to a variable, was set to a character object. And so this pointer was looking at that object and it was like, yep, it's there, I've got it. But then when you did a rematch and those characters got destroyed, the possessed pawn was still set, even if it got set to destroyed after, and thus it was never reset to the proper value. Okay, so we need to make sure that we reset this value, and to do that, I make this function here. Once you've made it in the .h file, you can go into your .cpp, go wherever you want, make a new function, and literally all I do in the function is set our possessed pawn variable back to null pointer. This is just resetting it, because if I reset it, it allows it to be assigned properly again in tick. This logic where we get the pawn and set it only fires if not possessed pawn. Basically, if possessed pawn is invalid or null pointer. Since we set it back there after clearing it, it can now go into this if statement again and grab this when a new pawn becomes available. You don't have to do this on tick either. This is how we were doing it. But you could, of course, send out a notification or an event and say, okay, the pawn is ready, the character's been spawned. Once that happens, we should then grab the pawn and set it to a possessed pawn variable. All right, one other thing we should do, and this isn't necessarily required right now, but there'll definitely be issues in the future if we leave this the way it is. With all that logic that we're talking about, where we can switch between keyboard and controller or gamepad with both characters, and with the fact that when we do rematches, the possessed pawn could be reset, this setup input component in our controller could get messed up. This is because setup input component fires when the characters are spawned, and it binds actions. It binds input actions, it binds input axes. This game mode player 1 very well may be invalid. And if it's invalid, but the get pawn is also invalid, also null pointer, then this comparison equal could be considered true because it's null versus null. And so with that in mind, this is the if statement we had, this one I commented out. But if we do that, then both player 1 and player 2 could get bound to this same action, which would cause some ugly logic where both the characters, one or both the characters, depending on where the bug occurs, would be getting double input for left and right, and we don't want that. So I've gotten rid of this old if statement, and I have a new if statement here. This if statement is better because it works off the controller index, and this will be valid at the time of this, so it won't be a question of if it's going to be null pointer or not. So I call if get input index is less than or equal to 0, bind it to move right P1. Now, what this means, getInputIndex returns the controller ID. The controller ID starts at 0. That's the default one that spawns when the game is created. In our case, it spawns as a base player controller type because that is our default controller type in the game mode. And the first one is index 0. So I say less than or equal to 0 because it can be -1 if it's not found. But really, we probably don't want to bind it if it's -1, even if it doesn't hurt anything. So I'm actually going to swap this to be if it equals 0. We can go ahead and bind call move right. This is the keyboard one. Remember, controllers, they can be bound no matter what because it's not 2 players on one device. So it won't hurt anything. All right. But specific inputs on keyboards, such as move right P1, they can be checked like this, and now this will only ever be bound for player 1. We can totally separate the controls if we need to for player 1 and player 2. The only reason I've left all these open is because all of these have their controller inputs. I've only separated move right P1 and move right controller because I may want to determine the logic for move right and move right controller differently because some of them do have, like the controller often has a joystick and keys are often just on or off. So I've separated them, but the important part here is that we can separate them for each player, for each controller, player controller. All right, that'll fix up a future bug with that. Now, that hopefully wasn't too bad. With that, we've actually fixed pretty much everything that we need to fix to get controllers working. But I want to fix 2 issues with rematches regarding controllers and the player controllers in general. And then I also want to fix a few various bugs that I noticed that are important for upcoming episodes regarding controllers and rematches. So if we go into our default game mode BP, we have our level streamed in logic, and we go through and we spawn all of our characters and do everything that we normally do when the game starts. But we have rematch logic, which we have the ability to perform a rematch through level streaming, or we can just reset the values, which is quicker, but it's a little bit more dangerous. We have to make sure everything is set up correctly. It was working, however, there was an issue, and that is we were destroying our player 1 and player 2 characters, and when we destroyed them, the possessed pawn had this invalid reference, but it wasn't being reset in the tick. So we can clear the pawn, and then we can go ahead and actually control our characters again after rematch. There is still a bug with camera edges and boundaries when performing a rematch. That will be solved in the very near future, so be aware of that. But we had no control over our characters after setting up the base player controller, so I'm going to go ahead and sort that out right now. This is the logic we will be needing, but I'm going to go ahead and expand this a bit, make it look nicer. I just did that so I knew exactly where it was, and I could show you the obvious difference. Nothing else in this event has changed. So let's put this in the right spot. Whoops, I don't really want to do all that, do I? Just that. And this is clean enough. I like to keep it clean for you, but that's probably good enough for right now. I had plugged this in right before the episode, and I had the loot body going directly to the destroy actor. It was still actually working, but make sure you do this only off the completed, just so that you're not looping through all this logic twice. It's a lot more work than is necessary, and could probably hurt your performance, although it does still work. But make sure you go get all actors of class, grab your specific controller class. I'd recommend grabbing the base player controller class specifically. This is because if you grab a player controller class and you do any logic with like AI or something similar, if you ever use a player controller as the parent, then it is going to use the player controller. It's going to grab all those types and loop through and try and call this. However, if you just grab the base player controller class, you're not going to have that issue. Benefit to having a base player controller is that you can also just call the function that we want to call on it without casting the array element. So I recommend getting all actors of class for the base player controller, or simply getting base player controller 1 and 2. You could save them out to a game mode or a game instance somewhere if you'd like. But they will exist in the world, so you can grab them, loop through them, and call our clear possessed pawn function. Once you've called this, you're good to go. These values will be reset on rematch, right? This gets called on rematch. Once these values are reset, we can then go destroy the actors, and then once new ones are spawned in spawn players later in the logic, then those controllers will be used to repossess the new characters, in which case you will have control over them again. Now, with that said, there's something else we can do in here too that is completely unrelated and doesn't even hurt anything, but it's just been bothering me that we've had it set up this way. So I'm going to go into my determine character class function. This is where we set up the characters that are spawned based on our choices in the character select screen. We were setting the owner of the character to be an actor that gets passed into determine character class. It's called from spawn players, and the actor we're passing in is the spawn point. Now, I get that we could have been doing this to get the position, but we were already getting the actor transform. So honestly, I'm not sure why this was something that I chose to do. It doesn't hurt anything necessarily, but it is weird. So I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of anything regarding the actor parameter in the determine character class function. I'm just going to flat out delete it. Okay, it'll throw some errors potentially depending on what you have set up in there. But screw it, just get rid of it. We have a reroute node here. I'm going to get rid of it and follow the chain. And it was being passed to the owner for all of the character types we're spawning. Get rid of that. We don't want to set the character's owner to be the spawn point. Again, not really hurting anything, but while we're in this sort of logic, I figured let's just fix that up and get rid of that. We don't need that. All right, now something that's important in here in the default game mode BP is the spawn players function. Let's go back in here now. So everything up to here where we pick the character and set the player reference is valid. However, there's something we were doing in here that needs to be changed now. I'll hook it back up the way it was, and then I'll show you what I'm doing. So for player 1, we were setting the player 1 reference, and then we were just possessing it with the default player controller. This is actually fine even now because we don't have networking, so we don't have specific player controllers we have to use. So really this isn't even necessarily a hack. It still works perfectly fine like this. However, for player 2, we were trying to determine how we wanted to set our player controller, and we were doing this based off of if both players were on a keyboard or if they were on controllers. This logic is kind of obsolete because at this point, we don't just have, 2 players are on keyboard or 2 players are on a controller each. They can actually be on different devices. Because of this, we don't want to just spawn a player controller every time the spawn players function is called if the players are on keyboard. If this is the case, they wouldn't be able to swap properly to their new controller or their gamepad if they want to do that. And on top of it, when you do a rematch and this function gets called again, a new base player controller is spawned. We don't want to do that. Instead, we want to access the controllers that already exist. So when I came in here, you probably saw it was like this. Both branches going into this logic. Really, though, that doesn't make a lot of sense. We don't need to do that. I just did that as a demonstration to show you we don't need this top logic anymore. So you can flat out get rid of this top logic and then nodes associated with it, and as well as the transform here. Okay, so now what I have looks like this. However, what's the point of doing this branch if both scenarios lead to the same section? So I can also get rid of this branch now, and we'll clean this up in a second. But now player 2's logic can look like this. Get all actors of class, player controller, grabbing index 1 from it specifically. We do know that player controller index 0 will always be here first because we spawn the next player controller in the main menu. I pulled up the node so you can see. We had this node in the main menu. That way we could spawn a player controller and it could control things like on the character selection screen. When we have connections and disconnections, we can create the player controllers as we please and remove them as we please. So keep that in mind. But for now, it is being spawned on the main menu, so we know for a fact that the first index player controller, index 0, is always going to be spawned first. So assuming we're not spawning more controllers than we need, index 1 player controller is always going to be the correct controller. Now, we can go ahead and possess this. However, I did something else again where I put this down below. I know this is a mess right now, so let me clean this up for you. Let me get rid of all these reroute nodes. Okay. So what I was doing was this. I had player 2 being possessed by player controller 1. Kind of the same as above now. It's not really a lot different. We're just grabbing a different player controller. Now, this would be fine. You could just pass in player index 1. But I do like doing the get all actors of class with a specific index because I do like to show that we're using the specific base player controller class. Again, not necessarily required, but something I like to do. Now, something, however, just like I mentioned earlier, instead of using player controller like we were before, we might as well switch it to base player controller. Okay, so this is what we had. This is what I'm using. Honestly, essentially the same exact thing, just not the standard player controller class, but the base player controller. I'm going to go ahead and just delete this logic and move mine up. Okay. So just like that. And now spawn players is much more functional. It's not spawning additional player controllers every time a rematch happens, which makes this logic a lot more clean. And all in all, we are just in a much better spot. Our system is working as intended, and it's not adding a bunch of extra data that we have to keep track of that is slowing down our game. So now the default game mode BP is good. We don't have to change anything else in there, but we've done a lot to improve upon it, as well as improve upon rematches. All right. One thing, on the character select screen, I also recommend doing this. Okay, so in the character select screen, we have the same sort of thing, where we're getting all actors. We're specifically grabbing the index 1 for player controller and setting that to the player 2 PC. This is used for controls on menus for player 2. This is a hack that we'll be fixing up in the very near future. But for now, this is how player 2 can move around and get all of their characters and levels selected properly using controller. With that said, we still are going to need a reference to each controller. So even though that's a hack up above, this is still relevant. And because of that, I want to make this change everywhere necessary, so we don't need to use the regular player controller anymore. We can use base player controller. Okay, so this is character select screen, event construct. Now swapping this out for this logic right here. And that's all we need to do, but I just wanted to point that out. That way everything I'm doing is shown off. Don't need the character select screen anymore. All right. Versus pause menu. Let's go to that now. So versus pause menu, when we pause the game, we have the ability to perform a rematch. Since we're focusing on rematches, I figured I would include this. Now, we have remove from parent, and then I was setting the input mode to game only afterward when performing a rematch. This is actually pretty funny because I'm surprised that I could get away with setting the game paused after resetting the match value and removing the widget from the parent after this. Technically, this does still fire, but if you were to fire this fast enough and this was removed from parent, even if there was logic afterward, this could actually screw up and miss some nodes. So I'd recommend moving this around a bit just to avoid any possible issues in the future, even though I'm not running into them now. And I'm not sure if anybody will based on how we set up our logic, but it's just better to do it this way, honestly. So what I'd recommend doing is this. I'm going to take my set game paused. I'm going to disconnect it. I'm going to move it to the very start. Okay. We can still get our game mode and everything like we're doing regularly. We don't have to change anything with that. I just want to do it in a slightly different order. Then I want to disconnect remove from parent. Change the input mode to game only. And then call remove from parent here. Alright, so when rematching, we have a slightly different order now, where we unpause the game, reset the values, then set the input mode game only, and then remove this widget. That way everything is done before the widget is removed, and thus no logic gets left behind under any circumstance. There is one other spot I'd like to do this, and this is on the resume button. We unpause the game and we set the input mode to game only, but we do remove from parent before doing that. Again, I would like to disconnect the remove from parent and put it at the end of the logic in the resume. Just like that. This is just a little quality of life improvement. Doesn't really change much for us now, but it could change things with us in the future. I showed you this before on the versus end menu. This is the same thing as before, where for some reason we had this invalid message node that was left here, and I never cleaned this up. I'm just going to delete this now and move load level up. Clean it up for you. Alright guys, and there you go. With all that done, we have properly functioning player controllers. We have 2 controllers, 1 player holding each controller working on it. We have them being able to swap between gamepad and keyboard. We have better functionality on rematches and the control of the characters. I'll show you a rematch real quick. We do this. Go through our standard stuff. I can skip it if we want, and we have control over characters. So we have everything working as intended, and we have much better logic, much cleaner logic as well. So it's easier to read, easier to use. Everything's better about it. If you enjoyed this video and it helps you learn more about player controllers and physical controllers, then please subscribe. It does more for myself and the channel than anything else you can do. I just really appreciate it. I want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon members and supporters. Thank you guys for all that you do. I love working on this content for you week after week. I'm glad you guys enjoy it as well. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. I'd be happy to assist you and get you sorted and back into the same spot so that you're ready for the next episode. Anyway guys, that's all I got, so thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye guys.